Today's topic is imposter syndrome. We're calling it rewriting our inner narrative. Imposter syndrome, it is defined as the fear and self-doubt of one's abilities, skills, and accomplishments commonly experienced in high achieving individuals. We'll be all surprised to know a KPMG study finds 75% of female executives across industries have experienced imposter syndrome in their careers. In fact, another survey in the tech industry, 58% of people with over 10 years of professional experience reported frequently experiencing imposter syndrome. As part of this webinar, we'll delve deep into these hard-hitting statistics with our esteemed panel, how it influences various demographics, and its profound impact on our individual performance and well-being. And I think most importantly, how do we succeed despite imposter syndrome while acknowledging its reality? So without further ado, I'll pass it on to you, Achal, to introduce our esteemed panel.
Thanks you so much, Ratna. So we are very fortunate to have our speakers here today, Shaldeep and Karen Shiozaki. Shaldeep recently joined Experian as the Chief Operating Officer of EMEA and APAC regions. She's responsible for developing and executing product and technology strategy alongside managing risk and compliance. Prior to Experian, Shell was the Chief Product Officer at TransUnion in the EMEA region. We also have Karen with us today. Karen is a partner with Fortium Partners, which is a leading provider of interim fractional C-suite leadership. She brings 18 years of experience at Fortune 500 corporations to Fortium's clients. And Karen has also served as an advisor to venture capital groups and served on the board of a startup technology company. Before we jump into our topic, I want to also introduce Pradeep Khanna. Pradeep Khanna is the CEO of Global Mindset, and he's the co-founder of InSquare, which is the organization that is bringing us this event today in partnership with Women in Experian. Pradeep, can you kick us off with a couple of minutes of introduction about yourself as well as about InSquare?
Anshul, thank you very much. Girls, a very good morning, good evening, good afternoon, good night, depending on what part of the world you are. I know that it is 5 a.m. where I live, which is in Sydney, in Australia. So we have a global forum that we are really involved in today. Just by way of introduction, while I come from India, I've been living in Australia for the last 32 years. I'm also the former head of global delivery for IBM Australia and New Zealand, and I'm very deeply involved into the metaverse ecosystem at this particular point in time. And some of my focus areas are inclusion as well as sustainability. Now, to talk about InSquare, we have to go back to the COVID days. Those interesting times when all of us were locked into our homes. We had a family, we had the husband and wife possibly working in different rooms. We had the kids having homeschooling. And guess what? It was the females who had the highest impact. The work life boundaries for all the females just simply disappeared. So these were very, very challenging times, and the two critical points which came up were number one was there was a rapid digital transformation taking place of all humans all over the world, and inclusion was coming to the fore. Something that had been talked about for and had, with so many corporate kind of targets and all that, it is now coming to hit us very strongly. So Anshul, myself, and a couple of guys and girls got together and we kickstarted an initiative called InSquare, which stands for Innovative Inclusion in the New Normal. The new normal is now the post COVID phase. This is a phase where emerging tech is kind of overtaking our lives. Inclusion, especially when I look at the metaverse world where I'm involved, while 60% of the employees are women in the metaverse ecosystem, only 35% are in leadership roles. Is it because of the imposter syndrome? A good question. And likewise, sustainability is also a very, very big issue which is hitting us. So, in summary, when we looked at InSquare, it was all looking at emerging trends, the new normal. How do we manage this in an innovative manner to bring about innovation and sustainable inclusion and sustainability? So these were the key elements. But when we look at inclusion, it's not just from a social responsibility perspective. There's enough evidence to indicate that by having an inclusive workforce, the individual and organizational performance gets a very, very big boost. So we need to leverage those positive aspects. With that, Anshul, I'll hand it back to you to take this forward. And thank you so much for putting together this initiative today with all the other speakers over here. Over to you, Anshul.
Thank you, Pradeep, for that great introduction. And just one more comment that I will add to the Instagram introduction is it has a very great network, excellent network of speakers across the world in US, Australia, and India. And through partnerships like this, we plan to have more of these events where we can bring like-minded speakers, leaders from the industry, from both companies, Experian and InSquare, together or for events like this one. So with that, I'm going to jump straight into our topic, which I know most of us are waiting to hear from our speakers on, which is imposter syndrome. And I'll start with Shell, with you with any stories that you'd like to share with us.
Yeah, thank you, Angel. And first of all, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. So where I am right now, it is evening. So I'm based in London. And thank you all. And thanks especially Anchal and Renuka for organizing this. And it's great to be here with Karen and Pradeep on the panel. Imposter syndrome, as in Renuka actually shared some great statistics, right? So one of the ones is that particularly resonated with me was that more than 70% people have experienced imposter syndrome at some point in their career. So when I experienced it was, I was reflecting on this, and I thought of a time when I was at HSBC. So I was with HSBC for 17 years. Most of that was in the US. Actually, it was balanced between US and UK. So about 7 years in the US, 2 years in Hong Kong, 2 years in Malaysia, and then another 7 years in UK, here based in London. And the context to the situation is that, in fact, I was doing really well there. And in fact, I was basically promoted from SVP to EVP within like 2 years, which was the fastest. And a lot of people actually start seeing plateauing at SVP level. So the context is important because, imposter syndrome, it doesn't matter how you're performing in your career or the realities. You might actually look really successful. It's about your inherent and internal conflict that you have, right? So it's interesting. So my mentor, who was actually, he promoted me twice. He used to give me feedback, right, in terms of how I was doing, how I could do it better. So when he gave me feedback and we used to have those discussions and sessions, I would completely ignore all the good things he would tell me about, my accomplishments and how I was contributing to the organization. But I would just fixate on the things that he would tell me how I could do better, right, as in the improvement areas. And it was just very interesting when I reflect back on it that, I was so self-critical and I was not really enjoying and celebrating the success that I was having professionally. So that was, the phase where I think, that is what imposter syndrome is, that irrespective of how successful you are, you set really high standards for yourself. You want to be perfect, and anything less than perfect is where you feel that, you're not performing and you're a failure. So I then got a professional coach, and I had a great relationship with my professional coach. She helped me see that balanced perspective, and she helped me see, my strengths and the achievements I was making. But interestingly, again, somewhere down, and she was very impressed, with the way I was coming across in the business. But, down below somewhere I felt, but she only knows what I tell her, right? She only knows the story. So she might not know what reality is, and I might not be as good as what she thinks I am, right? So that is what imposter syndrome is. Um, then how you deal with it is actually experience, and don't set really stringent and hard targets for yourself. Don't think you'll be a perfect person at everything that you lay your hand on. Think of yourself as a work in progress person, where you're building on skills and experience, and it comes with experience as well. I think towards the in the beginning of your career you feel that more, but towards the later end you realize that these are the things you learn over time, and you start facing it much more head on. So that was my encounter with imposter syndrome.
That's a great story, Shell. And I think from personal experience, especially when women and men, and we have, happy to be joined by a lot of men today as well, given this topic, because men also face imposter syndrome, and women and men both, I think, in situations where they're in a new role or get promoted, kind of tend to feel this a little bit more. And your guidance to get a professional coach is something that I think can be very helpful, especially in senior leadership roles. To give that external validation and confidence, and just have a sounding board as well. Moving on to you, Karen. What is your experience with imposter syndrome? Any areas in your life where you've encountered it more than others that you'd like to share with us?
Sure. And as you say, imposter syndrome can affect anyone at any stage in their lives, right? Personally, I have to say I've seen it more frequently in women and definitely in girls. I do a lot of volunteering with our local public school district, and it's kind of scary to see how girls don't have that self-esteem that they really need to have. And there have been studies that actually showed that there are a high proportion of men that have never even heard the term. Why is that? Yeah, and as Shell's saying, right? If you're praised, men just seem to accept it and say, yeah, I deserve it. Women think, oh, maybe I just got lucky, or gosh, if it wasn't for all these other people, I wouldn't have gotten to where I am. Yeah, another thing that I found in terms of contributing to imposter syndrome, especially in the interaction between men and women and girls and boys, mansplaining. If for those of you that don't know mansplaining, that's when a man talks condescendingly or over or under explains something, or will jump in to provide an answer before you've even said, I need to have an answer, right? An example of that that I thought was interesting. My mom was an oncology nurse, so her specialty was to help administer chemotherapy to patients. So one day there was a patient she had, and the woman's husband was with her, and my mom comes in. He goes, "Are you the doctor?" She goes, "No, I'm the nurse. I'll be taking care of your wife's chemotherapy treatment today." So my mom proceeds to explain what was going to happen. She's going to insert the intravenous needle, and here's the bag of drugs. The husband interrupts her. And he says to his wife, he goes, well, let me tell you how this intravenous stuff works, right? And talks over my mom. And my mom interrupts and says, I'm sorry, I didn't realize you were a doctor. And the guy goes, no, I'm an accountant. And so, now, fortunately, my mom was solid enough in her profession and knew. And so it's like, give the guy an eye roll and move on. But those kinds of things happen. I mean, I remember when I was first starting to get into cybersecurity, there'd be these gentlemen that would say, oh, this is really complicated. I'll have to explain it to you later. Or would proceed, if I'd say, well, I bring up a cybersecurity topic, they'll start to explain it to me. So, those things sometimes, especially if you're starting out in a field, you could say, oh, maybe I don't really know, or, why am I here? I was also CIO for a while of a media company, and working with them really brought to mind how media can have an impact on imposter syndrome. So in the reporters, as they're writing up their stories, you'd notice a change in language, or a way language works. So in one case, they were talking about a debate over some regulation in the state legislature. The woman representative was complaining. the guy, her counterpart, who was stating his opinion, he was stating an opinion, but she was complaining. So you see that sort of gender bias creep in, and that can kind of also contribute to imposter syndrome. They talk about a man with swagger is seen as having confidence, but if a woman has swagger, she's seen as arrogant and overly confident. All negative things, right? Um, Now today, if you think about what's happening with social media, right? And social media impacts adults and kids, right? Social media can lead you to make unhealthy comparisons to other people. And think about it. You go on there and you look at people responding to your post. Maybe you don't even know a lot of those people, or you're looking at Instagram and you're looking at people that you don't even know, but you're comparing yourselves to them. And let's face it, a lot of the photos and everything, they're touched up like significantly. So it's not realistic. So it leads you to think that your true self isn't good enough. And this particularly distresses me with the kids these days because today, as I was saying, in my experience professionally, I've tended to see imposter syndrome more often with women and girls than with men. But right now, the young boys are being negatively impacted by social media, just as the girls are. If we don't address this, we are now going to be raising a whole generation of girls and boys into men and women that will suffer from that. So
That's some great points you made there, Karen. Especially liked how you related to outside of the professional world, right? In terms of child, how children are being subject to that. And increasingly, I'm seeing the psychology behind imposter syndrome is now becoming more focused on those external factors. Traditionally, the approach was okay, there's something intrinsic about women or men who experience this in terms of how they process and think. But I seeing more and more instances, especially in the last few years, of research focused on how it's not necessarily you who's the problem, it's the what you're subjected to in a social context that's actually causing imposter syndrome. So love the points you made there. This is a great segue for a quick audience poll to hear from our audience. So we have a question for everybody. What types of, on a scale of 1 to 5, how frequently do you feel imposter syndrome affects your confidence at work? 1 being very rarely and 5 being very often.
So while the poll results are still coming in, the next step is probably to answer the question, what are the different types of imposter syndromes? And I know Shell mentioned a little bit about the perfectionist type, wherein I feel that, God, if unless I'm absolutely perfect, I could have still done better. That's one trait or one type. Another type of imposter syndrome is the expert, wherein I would feel as an imposter unless I have gained or mastered every single step of that process. But that's not reality, right? Like we can still be an expert until who defines that 100% expertise. Another type is the natural genius, wherein I feel that, oh, I'm naturally not intelligent. When I was born, I'm not intelligent enough as the other person. But what we forget, and this is something that I learned very early on in my life, probably Thomas Edison, he failed 9,999 times before he created that one bulb. So different types of imposter syndrome. And Shal, I would like to hear from you and Karen as well. Which is the type that you have experienced most commonly, and how did you deal with it?
Yeah, so I think, yeah, you explained some of those, Renuka. The one that I have basically most experienced is the natural genius. And this one basically not only says that, I want to be an expert over time, but it says, I want to be an expert in the first go. Right. So, and the context behind that as to how I identified with it was a little bit in terms of, it, there's a, as in, I think we're going to later on maybe talk about the culture impact it has and the gender impact and other such things, right? So I am the first engineer to be an engineer, not just a woman engineer in my extended family, right? And then I went to the topmost engineering school in the country, Anchal. In fact, we share that school. We went to the same engineering college back in India. And, the acceptance rate is actually less than 0.5% there. Then I went for MBA, which is another, best school in the country, and the acceptance rate is even lower. It's less than 0.1%. And then, obviously throughout you think that, oh, you've been told you're a straight A student, and you're always, told that, oh, you're the best. And there are high expectations that, suddenly start surrounding yourself, not only from yourself, but also from others, right? And then when I joined my first job after MBA, I joined a sales team with an organization which was later on acquired by Citigroup. And little did I know anything about sales at that time, right? Going to the field and building relationship with these brokers and the lending financial institutes. And obviously, I didn't succeed at that, right? In the first go for sure. And obviously, I got the feedback, and I knew that I wasn't really thriving there as I was used to thriving in all my life before that. So that was a time when I realized that I would identify with the kind of imposter syndrome, Renuka, as you defined, which is naturally genius. And I think the learning from there is that you should not think that you would be an expert or a perfectionist in the first go and at anything, right? You need to learn and gain experience over time and give yourself, and nobody is perfect. Forget about being perfect in the first go. So that's what basically I relate with most in terms of imposter syndrome.
Awesome. Thank you, Shell, for sharing your experience with us. How about you, Karen?
I have to say that I have experienced the perfectionist version of the imposter syndrome. Um, from a personality perspective, I am a little bit OCB anyway. That's, very detail oriented, love things to be in order, very structured. So that kind of lends to one becoming somewhat of a control freak. And when my first managerial position, I was, because I had always thought I have to be 100% perfect 100% of the time, that I felt, oh, well, I've got this team of people now. I really have to micromanage them. Right. So, yes, I did a lot of micromanaging in my early days, which, as we all now know, as we progress in our careers, we know that will never work. That never ends, that always ends up badly. I had a great difficulty in delegating. And that's because I felt I couldn't really trust anybody to do it perfectly. And even when I did delegate, I would get really frustrated. That micromanagement aspect would come in. You know, we've all been there where we've gotten projects where the deadlines and the objectives have been outrageous. And very rarely would anybody succeed in achieving those. But when I missed the mark on some of those outrageous set deadlines, I would feel so bad, and I would probably fall into a funk and beat myself up for days thereafter. When you are a perfectionist, the other thing that kind of kicks in is there's another aspect of a personality type where you become sort of isolationist. Maybe that's not quite right, but the soloist, right? Because you also feel like you can't ask for help because it's going to be a sign of weakness that you've asked for help. So when you don't ask for help, now all of a sudden the burden is to have everything on you. Things snowball because you can't possibly do everything. You can't possibly know everything to do it right. It compounds the problem, and then you ultimately end up failing. So unfortunately for me, my first leader in that entry level managerial role had no idea how to deal with it. So I didn't do very well in that first role. Fortunately, thereafter, I found other leaders was that would be able to recognize these things and had the professional maturity to help me get out of that.
Yep. And the soloist, Karen, again, thanks for sharing that category. Just a constant reminder to each one of us, it's okay to reach out for help.
So let's move on to our next question. That was, a very educational piece for me, especially to learn about the different types of imposter syndrome. I can definitely go back to some of my different points in time where I've experienced. I think perfectionist is one that impacts many of us, both men and women. So thank you for sharing that. Now we'll move on to a little bit more on the solutioning aspect, to hear from you, Karen and Shell, around how have you felt supported in your journey whenever you've encountered imposter syndrome? Also, of ways that you can share where you've supported others, where you've seen other people that you work with experiencing imposter syndrome, how you kind of shown up for that and supported them. So we'll start with you, Karen, this time.
Okay. Uh, so I mentioned that I did find some good leaders to help me get over the perfectionist slash soloist imposter syndrome aspect. Uh, in my case, I had a very excellent leader who helped me overcome the obsession with perfectionism. And during our one-on-ones, we would explore whether it was perfectionism or maybe I had set some unrealistic standards for myself that might be contributing to me not quite performing to my best. And we would talk about those. He was really good about explaining and pointing things out in a very professional and non-threatening way. And so that way, he'd also help me to start recognizing negative behavioral patterns that were tripping me up in terms of excelling as a leader. And the other thing I appreciated about him, he was also very skilled at shifting the focus to effort rather than flawless outcomes, because I would be so focused on the flawless outcome. And he would say, no, let's talk about the effort and recognize the good that I did. And the mantra that he gave me, and to this day, if I find myself kind of flipping into it, I bring that up. It's never confuse perfection with success. And that helps me refocus and get grounded again if I start going off on a tangent. When I was offered my first CIO job, the perfectionist in me made me question my preparedness to take on that role. And this same leader, I said, because it meant leaving the company I was with and, moving out of state, moving to this new company. And I said, I was talking to him and I said, yeah, I don't think I'm going to take it. I don't think I'm ready. And he looked at me and he said, you went through how many rounds of interviews? They actually offered you the job. He says, you've got this. And I was still like, oh, I don't know. And so he says, well, I'll tell you what I'm going to do. He goes, you have to take that job or I'm going to eliminate your position. So he says, I'm pushing you out of the nest. You need to do this. You have this. And, that kind of so then the rest is history. And it was quite good to know that he had my back and that, and I was still able to call on him even though I'd left the company, was working in a new place, new state, I was able to call on him, and he was always there for me. So that was really good. I really think of him very fondly, and he probably had the most impact in terms of me overcoming that perfectionist imposter syndrome. But so how do I support others? Well, for one thing, I'm always very careful to validate their feelings and experiences, right? Because you want to let people know it's normal to sometimes feel like an imposter. We all do. And even though, Shale and I have been in our careers and we're quite accomplished, we still, every once in a while, something's going to creep in. It never leaves you. So you want to reassure people that it's normal, that even I feel it, but also reassure them that, of their capabilities and the good things that they do. Yeah, make sure you stress their strengths and the accomplishments. With some of my folks that are going through this, I say, let's keep track of all the wins and milestones. Create like this little journal so you can look back and say, if when you come and say, oh, I'm a failure, we pull out this little journal and say, look at all the great things you've done. And then finally, if you're going to be depending on how bad the person's suffering from it, you want to identify the type of imposter syndrome that they're experiencing, because then you can tailor the approach for that particular type. And definitely, I say you want to always reframe the negative self talk. A lot of people that have imposter syndrome will say, I'm not worthy, I'm not qualified, I'm stupid, or whatever. You want to shift that negative talk to something that is going to be more growth oriented and affirmative for the person. And then the other thing that I like to do, and this may seem, some people think it's crazy. I personally like it. It's worked for me. I say, dress out of respect for yourself, dress for self respect. Because I know there have been people like one person in particular, I know that, and granted, we're all in business casual these days, but still, there are some business casual, and then there's like low end business casual. I could always tell when he's not feeling up to par because he's just doesn't dress as sharply, right? Um, so when we talked about him dressing for self respect, we see that because if you feel better about yourselves, even outwardly appearance, that will help. And not only that, the outward appearance, people see you and they say, they actually do. The visual is very important.
That's a great point. One of the things that I was when I was reading up on imposter syndrome was that how it's linked to your sense of self worth, whatever drives that self worth, and in some a lot of cases it could be how you show up physically, how you're dressed, that could make a difference. In a lot of cases your self worth is tied to what your societal role or expectations are, what your family conditioning has been. But I feel like there's a lot of intricate relationship between what drives your sense of value and self-worth and the areas where you feel imposter syndrome. So that's just something that I've kind of observed from my own experience as well. Thank you both for sharing, some of the strategies that that have helped you as well as that have helped others. Actually, I don't know if we covered that for you, Shell. I think I'd love to hear from you as well on, how you supported others and how you felt supported.
It's very interesting actually, listening to Karen. It's very similar as to how you support. But I would just reiterate that point that came up earlier in the discussion was that we do see imposter syndrome more amongst women and more amongst high achieving women, right? So there was also a study done where interestingly 54% of women always had this unfounded self doubt and always feeling underqualified, while 53% of men don't feel it ever, right? As Karen talked about, they never heard of it, right? It's the same thing. So especially in the context of work. So what I've noticed in the teams that I've managed that there are more women who face this than men in the teams, and essentially how you help them is by validating more with them regarding their strengths, the unique perspective they bring to the team, and also giving them the platform and opportunity so that they can leverage that strength that they have, and they all have different strengths, right? So either give them the opportunity to lead a high performing team or give them a cross functional strategic initiative to lead. And as you see them being successful, you basically reiterate that success to them and showcase them, that they were successful and they need to put themselves out there. Because I think one of the outcome of being imposter or suffering from imposter syndrome is that people don't take initiatives. They don't, realize their full potential. So basically, giving them that platform and then helping them, face that inner self doubt head on is something that I've seen help. And I've provided that support more to women because that's where I think they need more compared to men.
Absolutely. And I think both of you mentioned two things. Interestingly, one was validation, validation of people's own self worth. And secondly, supporting people or being supported by given opportunities. Because I think as women, I've definitely experienced this. And I think there's a common statistic on it too that women only apply for jobs when they feel they have 100% of qualifications. Men do it if they have, I forget what the percentage is, but it's less than 50% for sure. So it's, having those opportunities. Sometimes we just need to, be nudged or nudge other people to kind of grab those opportunities. Because sometimes we just don't feel like we deserve it if we are left to our own devices. So that definitely resonated with me.
Yeah. And Achal, very quickly adding to the one of, thank you, Cheryl and Karen and Achal for explaining the external factors. One thing that resonated with me in terms of combating this is probably internal, wherein I just extend my learning. I realized this about myself, and maybe the audience can also, some of you can relate to it. If you constantly keep learning and increasing your knowledge, you're just more confident, and then you're sort of trying to give that self the question about yourself or any doubt some sort of a we are just so much better when we are learning.
That is such a great suggestion, Renuka. I think, again, mm, it goes back to how you increase your self worth.
Yeah.
It's a strategy that works every time. Uh, Now, I think it is a great time to hear from our audience in terms of what works well for them. So, we have an audience question for everybody. By the way, on a side note, anybody has any questions of our panel, feel free to drop them in the chat window. Any observations, feedback, we will take up questions towards the end of the panel discussion. So the question for the audience is list one word or phrase that describes how you tackle imposter syndrome. Or alternately, feel free to list any support strategy you heard on this call from our panelists on how you would tackle imposter syndrome. Seek help, learn, believe.
Anshul, this is Pradeep.
Mm-hmm. Hi, Pradeep.
How does culture link up with imposter syndrome?
Almost getting there, Pradeep.
Yeah, that is our next question,
That's our
Pradeep. We
next
will
question.
get there very shortly.
Okay, over to
Yeah,
you.
right after
Pradeep.
this, that you
Yeah.
read our minds.
He sure did. This is great, team. Cheerleader, prepare where possible, opinion, self respect. So true. So true. Lean on, mentoring. Awesome. With this, up next, Shell, Karen, just delving a little bit deeper into the thing. As most of these tech enthusiasts on this call would relate to it, what is the RCA? What is the root cause analysis that you feel? Why does it even exist? Despite being the high achievers that we all are from professional industries, where did it start early on? What are your thoughts around that? We'll start with you, Shell.
Yeah, it's actually quite interesting that, imposter syndrome, as we talked about it, is experienced more by high achievers, right? Because they are the ones who think that they need to be perfectionists, they are the experts, and they set these really high standards for themselves. And if they're not able to achieve those high standards, sometimes they're actually impossible, those standards that they set for themselves. That's when they start feeling like a failure, and they think that they're not up to it and they don't belong, and then they have this self-doubt, and doubting their self-worth, as you were talking about, Anchal. In fact, and we see more of this in kids as well, especially this is quite prominent with students at the Ivy League, in the US, where all of those are so, as in, highly accomplished kids, right? Still, when they go there for the first time in that group of students, they'll be like, oh, I don't belong there, and I hope no one finds out that I don't belong to this group of high achievers. They forget that they are there in the first place because they themselves are a high achiever. So it's actually quite interesting. And that's why I think there is another study which says that, actually high achievers, they don't take a lot of risk later on in life because they think that they might fail at it. And hence they don't take a lot of risk. And they don't, live up to their full potential in terms of what they can actually achieve. So that's this is a correlation, Renuka, that we see, amongst kids, amongst professionals, and even in other aspects of life when it comes to being really setting, being a perfectionist, standards for yourself. I think the way to tackle is to basically accept that nobody's perfect. Some, even if you're such an expert, you can gain years of experience, you can get better at things, but you would still not be a perfectionist. So, we should not set those kind of standards for ourselves. We should celebrate the success that we have and celebrate the achievements and the strengths that you have. And as you were talking about Renuka as well, right? That keep developing, having growth mindset is really helpful as well. But at the same time, recognize the success that you're achieving on the way rather than thinking about, I want to be a perfectionist and I want to achieve everything right the first time.
So very true, Shal, and so very nicely put.
Yeah, and now we will get to the question around the cultural aspects and how that impacts potentially imposter syndrome. So, one example of this that we were thinking about before this session was, how women in certain minority cultures, or even perhaps women in general, uh, they are taught to practice humility, which kind of goes against the tenets of be self advocacy in a professional environment. And there's a certain kind of social anxiety, that underconfidence that comes with that. So just wanted to hear your thoughts, and maybe I'll put this to you, Karen. Do you feel there's a relationship between cultural upbringing and imposter syndrome, and have
Oh,
you
yeah,
experienced it?
absolutely. But I would say cultural factors aren't necessarily the direct cause, right? But they will contribute to it in many cases, because you think about different cultures will put different values on value of education, what a career is. Different definitions of success will vary by culture as well. And to your point about humility and modesty, if you are in a culture where those things are, it's good to have modesty, and self promotion is really bad, then that will contribute to imposter feelings in some cultures. So, for example, I had a team at one time who were based in Japan. Now, the culture in Japan is about fitting in rather than standing out. So when I try to recognize a team member in public and to give praise to this person for the excellent job that he did, it was actually very painful and embarrassing. And the team also thought, what's wrong with this guy? He's such a braggart and whatever. And so, you have to take that into account, because then it wasn't very good. And he did feel that, that wasn't good for me. And because it wasn't showing enough modesty. Gender and race, and if you have other forms of marginalized identity, it will intersect with cultural values, and that could help to amplify imposter syndrome. So I do have done some work with some of our kids, some of our minority kids coming out of school, going to college. What I had found for a lot of the kids, where they are the first generation to go to college, when we follow up with them in their first year, a lot of them struggle with imposter syndrome, feeling very strongly like they don't belong there. Somehow they got lucky, or they only got in because of their ethnicity. And so to help those kids say, no, no, you did get in on your merit. You wouldn't be here if you didn't get the good grades, if you didn't get the good tests, if you didn't have the activities. So to help them navigate these environments, that because they couldn't go back to their families because they were the first, and their families didn't really understand. They were just so proud they were there, but they didn't know how to help them. So to help those kinds of, in those situations where you are the first, you're the trailblazer, you will have imposter syndrome in some cases. And I think it's really important to pay attention to corporate culture, right? Because it can reinforce negative self perceptions, and it can limit opportunities for certain groups if the corporate culture is not welcoming and inclusive. So, an example of corporate culture, and Pradeep had mentioned how COVID impacted a lot of this, right? I saw a lot of the superhuman imposter syndrome happening during the COVID lockdown, because, as Pradeep mentioned, all of a sudden now, it's primarily the women that had to now deal with the kids doing virtual schooling, dealing with the people who were sick at home, dealing with elder care. I had a team that had complained to me about the two women members of their group being kind of slackers because they weren't showing up on time to the daily stand-up meetings. Well, the daily stand-up meetings were at 8:30 in the morning. That's about the time when most of the kids had to be put on virtual schooling. I had somebody who had decided that during the lockdown they were going to take their father out of the assisted living and bring them to live in the home with them. Well, their father had a specific need for certain medications at a certain time, and that happened to conflict. And the guys that were complaining about the women, they didn't get it. And of course, in the meantime, the two women knew that these guys were unhappy with them. So they began to feel, I'm a failure. I'm failing as a mother. I'm failing as a daughter who has to take care of my dad. And I'm failing at my work. I'm not good at my work. I can't do this. And in fact, one of them wanted to quit because they said, I just can't do this. I don't belong here. So you have to work through that. And this is also now having a come to God moment with the guys to say, you guys, be kind, have some empathy. And I brought up I say, think about for those of you that have significant others and spouses and kids, are you helping her? And it brings a realization like, oh, maybe I could do a little bit better. So
Some excellent points, Karen. And you mentioned about how cultural roles can impact imposter syndrome, because I know I experience this myself. Every morning I have to drop off my kids between 7:30 to 8, or get them ready or make them breakfast. Um, and whether you call it cultural or not, but it's something that I need to do. And I know not everybody who has calls at that time needs to do that, because and that could lead to imposter syndrome, because I'm feeling like, am I, I start questioning, am I, is this the right role for me if I have to be on calls at this time? So there is definitely a relationship there around imposter syndrome and some of the limitations, whether cultural, external, family, social, what have you, that cause this. So love how you made that point. And also the second point you made about how organizations and perhaps each of us at our own levels can facilitate that change. So one of the things I try to do is to make, my team members more vocal and encourage them to not attend meetings during times, or not hold meetings during time. And I actively decline meetings, letting them know why I'm declining it. I have to drop off my kids to school. I have to take them to an appointment. I have to go to the more verbal and vocal we are with what our personal limitations are, I think the more it encourages others in the organization to do the same. So I do feel there's an own of source responsibility of helping address imposter syndrome and other forms of inclusion, at the organization level. And each of us can be doing something around that. What a great discussion. It's so nice to hear on these topics. I know we have a few more minutes left, and I think we would love to hear from our audience about any questions that they have. Um, there are two ways to do that. You could drop it in the chat window, or you could raise your hand, and then we will unmute you and give you the mic. So feel free to ask any questions of our panelists, ask them about any other strategies, or just share your thoughts in general. And I think at this point, everybody's mics should be enabled. So you should be able to just get off the mic and ask a question as well.
Yeah, all safe environment. Feel free to ask your questions. I guess the first step towards combating this is to accept and talk about it.
And I think we have one question in the chat window. How do you deal with tackling imposter syndrome when oftentimes it feels like we may need it to motivate us or succeed?
That's a great question. So I can start on that, Karen, and you can maybe add your bits to it. So it's very interesting that there is a correlation between performance and these nerves that you feel when you feel like an imposter, right? And you do need to have certain level of that. It's actually a bell-shaped curve that for performing at your best, you do need to have a little bit of that. But if it goes beyond that bell curve and then it starts declining, that is when it starts impacting your performance. So it is really, so I think what you might be feeling the same and you're calling it imposter syndrome, but that is the necessary nerves you need to perform. And but if it starts impacting your performance negatively is when it is actually imposter syndrome.
Yeah,
Yeah.
no, I would agree with Shale. The other thing that you want to do is I call it finding your tribe. Make sure you have assembled a small group of trusted advisors that you can talk to, uh, because then they can help you also as you talk through your anxieties or whatever. Is it really that little edge, as Shale mentioned, that you need to push you to achieve what you have to, versus is that you're starting a downslide into imposter syndrome that will negatively impact you? So I do have a trusted network of friends that I feel very confident I can discuss a lot of things with, and like my own personal anxieties and feelings of discomfort in a very safe environment. And they help.
Wonderful. Yeah, I think feeling comfortable with discomfort is one of the hardest things that I've had to learn. It just goes against our kind of sense of, goes against our intuition and immediate kind of impulse. But it is one of the key ways to learn. And so, some amount of imposter syndrome may be healthy as long as we are not letting it overpower us into believing that we don't have that self worth.
We should thank Christine for asking that question. We need more.
Yes, this is a really
Yeah.
good question. actually. Any other questions? Again, let not imposter syndrome bother you in terms of asking a question. I know I experienced that many times.
Yep, me too, Achal. Just before the start of this webinar, I was thinking, will I be able to pull this off? So you have that self doubt no matter what.
Absolutely. No, we all experience that. And Karen and Shell, even after all these years and holding leadership positions, if they experience it, then, it's a very common phenomenon.
Yep.
I think we have about 3 more minutes and then we can probably wrap it up. But again, want to open it up once. So we have another question. Shelley asked this question: any tips, practices which helps to deal with these types of situations? I think we heard a few of them earlier around, mentoring and professional coaching.
I think one of the things that has helped me, and besides obviously the points that we've made, and Anshul, you were reiterating those, is that it's not about the outcome; it is about the effort, and you need to make the best effort in the constraints that you have, and you would always have constraints, right? At different life stage, different time, different needs that you have towards your family, towards your work. So I think as long as you do your best, you should feel pretty happy with that. It's, and as Karen was saying, don't confuse success with perfection. It doesn't have to be perfect. So that is something that has helped me, because as long as I'm happy with the effort that I've made within the constraints that I'm operating. And I think we need to be quite realistic about the constraints that we have, right? Like Anshul was saying, Anshul, you have to maybe give breakfast to your kids and drop them to school, right? So that is a constraint you have at the beginning of the day. So, you shouldn't feel that, you're not showing up at work at that time because you have this other responsibility that you need to deliver on. So that has helped me quite a lot. The other thing is that, I don't try to be an expert anymore, and I'm always in a learning mode, because learning always helps. You won't get to be an expert, and recognize there are other experts, right? But there would be things that you know better than others, and there are things that others know better than you. So you don't need to be at your best at everything all the time.
And I would also say, we talked about not asking for help, because people might think that you don't know what you're doing or it's a sign of weakness. Actually, being able to ask for help is a huge sign of strength, and that's why you should look at it because for the people that really struggle and don't ask for help, they're ultimately going to fail, and versus the person who has enough self-awareness and the confidence to ask for help. I think that's very important to keep in mind.
And those are great strategies to practice. One of the other things that I feel has helped me is also being aware of your strengths. I personally feel like we don't, that doesn't automatically come to us. I had to literally do some external assessments. Like, there's a great Gallup assessment that I love that gives you an assessment of your, top 5 strengths. But sometimes just having that feedback, either from others or doing an external assessment, and then just having in some way an awareness of your strengths also helps a bit with imposter syndrome, because you can then lean on those strengths whenever you're experiencing that. So that's something that has helped me. Renuka, anything from your perspective, something that's helped you deal with imposter syndrome? You mentioned learning earlier, of course, and that's a great one.
Achal, I want to just sum it up saying that we all need to be kind to ourselves. In the words of one of my favorite, Maya Angelou, we alone are enough. We have nothing to prove to anybody. So I've been, carrying this wisdom along with me, trying to face the challenges and just believing that, yes, every single person is unique. Our unique perspectives, skills, ideas, that's all that matters. And we are
That's an
making such a
excellent
big
point.
difference in this tech industry.
Being kind to ourselves, forgiving ourselves, and just self-validating. I
Yep.
think those are very, very key strengths to have. I think there is one more question we have in the chat window. Growing up, many of us were taught to practice humility, but our careers asked us to diverge from that. We touched upon that a little bit earlier. Another question here is, how do you speak up and take credit for your accomplishments without coming across as arrogant or complacent?
Um, well, if you're not used to doing that, you really want to make sure that you have an ally. Because so me as a leader, as a woman of color, and being Asian, so I understand where this person's coming from. Uh, you probably want to get, first of all, make sure you have an ally, and a lot of times that will be your leader, the person that you report to, and kind of it helps to be very honest, um, because perhaps your leader may not have that cultural awareness, but if they're a good leader, they will know. Then they can help be your ally to help encourage you. So what I do, for example, is I will in certain meetings, I'll know if one of my folks has an idea that they thought of, it's a great idea and they should bring it up. So I will deliberately say, well, Mary and I were talking about this great idea. Mary, why don't you share it with the group? And when Mary does finally, want to raise her hand independently, reaffirm that, say, thanks so much for sharing that. That was really good to hear from you, that kind of thing. Um, there's that whole concept of leaning in. It is true. We do want women to lean in. Sometimes it's hard to take that first step. So, to the extent you can find that ally to help you get there, and then just realize that every time you raise your hand, it's kind of like building a muscle, right? You're getting stronger and being able to exercise that.
Mm-hmm. I think Pradeep has a question too, or maybe some response to the discussion.
No, I just want to ask a question, which is that are there any positive impacts of the positive syndrome?
Positive impacts of imposter syndrome was what you're asking us, Pradeep.
I think we talked about it a little bit, right? That if it's at an adequate level, it actually helps you to perform better because you do want to perform well. You do want to come across as you're on top of your game. So it does help you to come across and be better prepared for task at hand. But if it becomes more than, if it starts impacting you much more, I think is where it becomes negative. So until then, Pradeep, I would say it has a positive impact for sure.
Yeah.
Yes.
And I think, yeah,
No, no, go
I
ahead.
would, I'll say, and think about the context of it too, right? So being and if you can put yourself into the context. So for example, for me to be 100% perfect 100% of the time in what I do, right? Whether it's governance or whether it's in, business continuity management, whatever. It's okay. I'm not going to be there. I do expect my surgeon to be perfectionist. So, right. So, so I would put myself on, I was like, I'm not doing brain surgery. It's okay if I'm not perfect.
I mean, to that extent, could positive imposter syndrome be like a dopamine that it kind of, motivates you to do better? Just a
I
question.
can see that happening. I can absolutely see that, the awareness of it can make you want to overcome it more. Especially it kind of goes with the competitive edge that many of us have, right? And it's like, okay, I'm going to overcome this. I'm going to beat it. So this can be definitely that aspect of it too, which can spur you into action.
Thank you.
As long as, like Shal was saying, we do not let it negatively drag us down. There has to be a thin line, between motivation and dragging us down.
Yep. Thank you.
Achal, I think we're almost out of time, Achal. Wrap up comments from you, Achal.
Yes, what an excellent, informative session. I really enjoyed hearing from our speakers. Thank you, Karen and Shell, for joining us, sharing your wonderful insights, and being so open about, sharing the stories you've experienced. I think that carries a lot of value, at least in my book, and I'm sure it's very valuable to our audience who was on the call. Thank you, Pradeep, for joining in, giving us an introduction of InSquare, and look forward to further events where we can partner together. Thank you to our audience for joining us, engaging with us, sending questions our way. Thank you to my co-host Renuka for facilitating this and all the prep that went into it. Thank you, Irene and Christine, for that. And then just to wrap it up, we learned quite a bit about imposter syndrome, the types of imposter syndrome, how it impacts our self-worth, and most importantly, the strategies on how to combat it. Whether it's going out, getting mentoring, that came up as a very strong theme, is external help, mentoring, or professional coaching, finding allies who can support you and who can validate your self-worth. And I'm definitely going to be trying a few of these. And then I think the overarching theme for me is how, there is an aspect of it that comes internally that we can address, but also externally being supported by, organization and creating an inclusive environment in the organization that can help combat imposter syndrome. So thank you so much for joining today. Really enjoyed facilitating this discussion. Look forward to many more on this topic and others.
Great. Thank you so much, Anchal and Renuka, for organizing this. It was great to be with you, Karen and Pradeep.
Yes. Thank you. Thanks for the opportunity.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
thank you.
Thank you
Thanks,
all.
everybody.
Thank you for your participation.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.